Hey guys, this is Parsifal. I also go by Will, and I am back with another character babble. Admittedly, I haven't been feeling these ones as well because I genuinely, for some of them, don't really know what to talk about. Because I know I could just talk about, like, what the character is like, what are their interests, what was my inspiration for their design. But, at some point, at least to me, it kind of starts feeling like it's all the same. And while it's definitely not. It's my brain is saying, "Oh, I've already said this in one way or another, and I've already done this." So, it doesn't want to do it again because it's repetition that I already know about. So it's been a little bit harder, but hopefully I can find some things to talk about for upcoming videos about upcoming characters. We'll see how it goes. But I do have something to talk about with this character. This is my OC Marshall Moreau Kane. Um, and he is one of my primary characters of my, like, generalized, like, world concept story, personal world stuff. And I wanted to talk about him because I think his original creation was very interesting and relatively unique to the way I sometimes make new OCs. It's not unique to him specifically in my roster because it actually happens quite a bit. It happens a bit even within the Kane family itself. But I figured I would talk about the process of making Marshall and how he sort of came to be. Um, so Marshall is one of the members of my primary OCs, the Kane family, and he is actually Dativo's son. And I've talked about Dativo on my channel before. I've talked about how he is a personal, like, projection OC for me. I care about his story a lot. I've worked on him for a while. Um, and Marshall is a character that originally, when I made him, he was actually just an alternate universe version of Dativo. I was doing a roleplay where Dativo was a child in a different setting than the one he was born in the story, where hypothetically, what would happen if Dativo was raised in a family that actually cared about him and was able to give him the attention that he needed and validation as he was growing up to succeed. Because that's the thing that Dativo doesn't have in his actual story. His family, some of them love him. There's a lot of weird interpersonal conflict about, like, ability to love versus expression of love, interpersonal conflict between family members, stuff like that. And Tivo generally, as a result, just does not grow up with a lot of love in his childhood. And so I wanted to see, like, what would happen if his needs were met in full, if his accommodations were different and actually there. And so there was an alternate universe concept where he was raised by the Moreau family, who is my sister's OCs, and they are genuinely just a very accommodating, welcoming family. Super warm, super loving. They have a very big family that they can use to make sure that everyone's needs are met, that kind of stuff. And in that RP, uh, we started off by just having them as children, and he was called Tivo because usually in those situations, well, the Tivo was a big fancy adult name, and so we shortened it because a kid isn't going to be able to say Dativo very easily. So they shortened it to Tivo, which is the nickname that Dativo usually ends up with if people are shortening his name anyway. And in this universe, he doesn't hate it because he's a child, and he ended up actually very happy and very successful as a child as he grew up in this RP. And he pursued music, he pursued acting. He didn't have to go into politics because the Moreaus are not a political family and they did not push him into things. He wasn't held to anyone else's expectations, so he didn't feel the need to show off by trying to be better than his brother in that, and he was just very bright and happy. And I really liked that concept, and I wanted to capture that more, and what I ended up doing was I ended up making Marshall DeTivo's son, because I felt like the concept of him being super happy and super bright and getting everything that DeTivo needed in life but couldn't have was a very interesting thematic thing for DeTivo, whose entire story is based on like what you deserve, what you're entitled to, what makes a good person, is it nature or nurture, and all these complex themes about like morality and stuff like that. So Marshall ended up as DeTivo's son, and as a result became a foil. In this story that then became canon, where Marshall is a son instead of just an alternate universe version of DeTivo ends up really disliking Marshall because Marshall stands for everything that he wasn't able to achieve. This highlights a lot of DeTivo's themes of self-sabotage and stuff like that. And Marshall is genuinely just really upbeat and peppy. He's super like bright and optimistic, and nothing DeTivo does really hurts him. He's like a bouncing ball. He just goes around, bounces around super energetically, and is always happy. He is sunshine and rainbows all the time. And this isn't because he's oblivious or stupid or anything, but because when I made him into DeTivo's son, and I made him, especially with the "this is DeTivo if everything went well," some things still stayed the same. Marshall still has the same, like, mental hang-ups and struggles that DeTivo does, especially with things like being self-centered and having low empathy. So Marshall just expresses it better, in a slightly healthier way, or rather in a way that isn't as obvious as DeTivo does, with DeTivo's like aggressive misanthropy and hatred. Marshall's selfishness results in him just being happy all the time because he enjoys life, and if DeTivo tries to make him feel bad, well, that's DeTivo's problem. That's not Marshall's problem. Marshall doesn't really care about what DeTivo thinks of him, and doesn't really care what anyone thinks of him. He is going to be happy and cheerful no matter what happens, because that's just his outlook on life, and no one can change that except for him. And he has decided that that's how he's going to live his life. Anything that could be a problem to his outlook, he's just going to ignore because he doesn't care. He is self-centered to his own worldview, and he really has no empathy for anyone who isn't. And this is very interesting because I don't usually see selfishness described like that, or self-centeredness described like that. It's usually phrased more as like obliviousness or naivety, and Marshall can somewhat be like that, but he's not naive to the fact that DeTivo immensely dislikes him. He just doesn't think that that's his problem. And so I found it very interesting to see DeTivo's issues handled in such a stark difference, because they're foils of each other now. And it started to create this really interesting dynamic of, are you fated to repeat what your parents were before you? What does and doesn't change from, the people you were born from? Even if you're raised by a different person, because Marshall was, even as DeTivo's son, raised by a different family. He was not raised by DeTivo. He didn't have any of the... He was kept away from DeTivo's, hatred and anything that could potentially give him trauma based around that, though he still does, obviously, have that knowledge that DeTivo doesn't like them, which can be traumatizing in and of itself. But he's genuinely, like, just got a lot of the same issues TiVo has mentally, with needing validation and being self-centered and needing to be right, but in a different way. And I find that really interesting, especially since a lot of people, when they see Marshall and TiVo at the same time, they see them as two totally distinct, separate people who are nothing alike. The idea of what makes you who you are, what it affects how you are as a person in terms of what is passed down personality wise, like morality wise, conceptually, idea wise, and how your brain works from parent to child, even if the parent didn't entirely raise you, is very interesting to me just because of how I was raised. Because I jumped through several different guardians and people who raised me over the years, and I always wonder, like, what do I keep from these people who come in and out of my life? Did X person who raised me as an infant and then as a teenager, but otherwise I didn't really like, what effect did they have on me, etc., etc. Like, I'm also adopted, so what effect did my birth parents have on me? I wouldn't know, and it's very interesting to me thinking about that. Especially because, like, I have things like ADHD, which Marshall also has, and technically DeTivo has it too, but he's never been diagnosed, which is part of the reason that is a lot of his problems exist, is because a lot of the stuff that he has, he's never been diagnosed with, so he doesn't know it's a problem. Marshall got those diagnoses at a young age because he had the infrastructure and support in place early on, and people who were able to spot the signs, so he has the accommodations he needs. But yeah, I'm losing my train of thought right now, and I think that's mostly what I want to talk about. It's just this interesting way that Marshall came about by being what happens if I put this character in the exact opposite situation, and then wanting to keep that, and then the effect that dynamic had on the story in general when I actually made this canon. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this little character babble about my OC Marshall. I certainly enjoyed talking about him, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put those down in the comments section below, and I will send you guys to the outro. Bye-bye! Well, that's the end of this video. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below in the comment section, or contact me on any of my social media, which is linked in the description below. I also have my Patreon there if you guys want to throw a monthly donation at me. Thanks so much for your support. I'll see you next time. Bye!